The first direct talks between Ukraine and Russia should have heralded a new era of diplomacy towards solving Europe's largest conflict since World War II. Instead, their context, brevity and limited outcome provided skeptics with more reasons to doubt Moscow wants peace. The three conclusions: a prisoner swap, further talks about their president's meeting, and both sides composing their vision of a future ceasefire, sound like progress. Ukraine has already said it wants an immediate and unconditional ceasefire on air, sea and land, and had already offered direct talks between President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. Russia rejected those two ideas, but Friday said it would again consider them. Diplomacy has traveled a long distance this week to essentially return to zero, back where it started on Saturday. Then, in Kiev, Ukraine, France, Germany, the UK and Poland demanded an unconditional ceasefire for a month, and published a picture of the 5 countries' leaders on the phone to President Trump. They trumpeted his backing for the truce, but also what France called massive sanctions if Russia rejected the demand. 6 days later, on Friday, they again posted a picture of the same 5 men, huddled again around a telephone, this time in the Albanian capital Tirana, talking to POTUS. French President Emmanuel Macron said it was unacceptable Russia continues to ignore a truce. The UK's PM Keir Starmer said Putin must pay the price for avoiding peace. The symmetry of the demands and the images was remarkable. In the past week, Trump has performed stunning diplogymnastics. Putin shrugged off the demands for a truce and suggested direct talks in Istanbul. Zelenskyy said he would meet Putin there, and Trump offered to be an intermediary. Putin rejected all bar a junior meeting. And then Trump deflated any sense of urgency by adding he never expected Putin to attend without his also being in Istanbul, apparently concluding that nothing is gonna happen on Ukraine before he meets the Kremlin head. We do not know how European leaders handled the Friday call, a concerned Macron pictured at its center, but they surely had to remind Trump of promises made. Trump has shown reluctance to pressure or speak ill of Putin in public. Yet now his credibility with his closest European allies, smart cookie Macron, and tough negotiator Starmer, who offered him a second state visit, is on the line. It is unclear whether this will stir him. We have now gone full circle, in just a week, through the contradictory emotions that beset the White House on this thorny foreign policy issue on which the U.S. administration has overpromised to deliver. 2 constants have emerged. Putin cares little for European or American pressure, simply proposing a minimalist peace offering, with maximalist demands, and refusing to budge. Trump seems to privately offer support to Ukraine and its allies, but publicly is seen extending the olive branch of a bilateral meeting with the Kremlin head, whenever Moscow is ready. Intermittently, this White House has been keen to telegraph that their patience with Putin is limited, even expiring. Occasionally, even Trump hints at this, vaguely touting secondary sanctions as a throwaway remark earlier this week. Yet this impatience has yet to translate into the firm action Europe wants to see. The White House benefits from the Kremlin's baby steps, insincere, inching towards peace. Russia does enough to permit Trump to pretend they are serious, while yielding no ground at all, even complicating matters Friday with the reported demand that Ukraine hand over territory Russia hasn't conquered. There are enough vague, intractable whispers of diplomacy and further talks about talks, to provide the tantalizing promise of a deal, without striking, or even delineating one. Russia is playing for time, evidently, and amassing forces on the eastern front line, drone images show, ahead of a likely summer offensive. Yet sometimes moments of clarity emerge. This week has perhaps helped elucidate where Moscow truly stands, but also to Trump's reluctance to cause Putin pain. Clarity can be uncomfortable, And on Friday a stark assessment of Trump's policy came from his former ambassador to Kiev, Brigitte Brink, who resigned last month. In an op-ed, Brink explained why, unfortunately, the policy since the beginning of the Trump administration has been to put pressure on the victim, Ukraine, rather than on the aggressor, Russia. As such, I could no longer in good faith carry out the administration's policy and felt it was my duty to step down. Peace at any price is not peace at all, it is appeasement. And history has taught us time and again that appeasement does not lead to safety, security, or prosperity. It leads to more war and suffering. It may be too early to determine whether Trump's soft gloves approach spells appeasement. But the US president has deflated a week of mounting tension and pressure on Moscow by suggesting no progress can be expected until he meets Putin. And, as was the case with the elusive summit between Trump, Zelenskyy, and Putin, do not expect this heady mix of egos, deference, and loathing to yield results. Is the lesson of the past week that Trump will, in person, force Putin into accepting concessions that months of pressure, and years of brutal battlefield struggles, have not even an eventual summit between Trump and Putin may not fix the war, but instead reset the clock on diplomacy, and like this week leave Ukraine back at zero. Russia and Ukraine have agreed to a prisoner swap following talks in Istanbul today. But Kiev's delegation also accused Moscow of making unrealistic demands during negotiations. Catch up with our latest Ukraine Q&A below. We'll be back with the latest updates soon. Until then, here's a recap of all that's happened today. Russia-Ukraine talks. For the first time in 3 years, Ukraine and Russia held direct peace talks today. Held in Istanbul and hosted by Turkey's foreign minister, the two sides failed to agree a ceasefire but did consent to a prisoner exchange of £1,000 each. They also agreed to hold further talks, while Russia noted Ukraine's suggestion of leader-level talks between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin soon. But it was not all plain sailing. The Ukrainian delegation, led by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, said Moscow made unrealistic demands during talks, while a source told Sky News that Russia threatened Kiev with an eternal war at one point. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was not in attendance. He gave a speech while attending a European conference in Albania. During that address, he said the world must respond to Russia if its peace efforts turn out to be theatrical, adding Ukraine's number one priority is a full, unconditional, and honest ceasefire. This must happen immediately to stop the killing and create a solid basis for diplomacy, he added. Sir Keir Starmer joined Zelenskyy, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, and Donald Tusk at the conference, with the group speaking to Donald Trump on the phone shortly after talks in Istanbul concluded. Istanbul, May 16. Reuters. Ukraine rallied support from its Western allies on Friday after Kiev and Moscow failed to agree to a ceasefire at their first direct talks in more than 3 years, with Russia presenting conditions that a Ukrainian source described as non-starters. Under pressure from US President Donald Trump to end the bloodiest conflict in Europe since World War II, delegates from the warring countries met for the first time since March 2022, the month after Russia invaded its neighbor. The talks in an Istanbul palace lasted well under 2 hours. Russia expressed satisfaction with the meeting and said it was ready to continue contacts. Both countries said they had agreed to trade 1,000 prisoners of war each in what would be the biggest such exchange yet. But Kiev, which wants the West to impose tighter sanctions unless Moscow accepts a proposal from Trump for a 30-day ceasefire, immediately began rallying its allies for tougher action. As soon as the talks ended, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy held a phone call with Trump and the leaders of France, Germany, and Poland, his spokesperson said. Zelenskyy said robust sanctions should follow if Russia rejected a ceasefire. Russia's demands were detached from reality and go far beyond anything that was previously discussed, a source in the Ukrainian delegation told Reuters. The source, speaking on condition of anonymity, said Moscow had issued ultimatums for Ukraine to withdraw from parts of its own territory in order to obtain a ceasefire and other non-starters and non-constructive conditions. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the Russian position was clearly unacceptable and that European leaders, Ukraine, and the US were closely aligning their responses. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the EU was working on a new package of sanctions against Moscow. Russia's lead negotiator, Vladimir Zelenskyy, told reporters that his team had taken note of the Ukrainians' request for direct talks between Zelenskyy and President Vladimir Putin. Putin, after proposing the direct talks, had spurned a challenge from the Ukrainian leader to meet him personally in Istanbul. We have agreed that each side will present its vision of a possible future ceasefire and spell it out in detail. After such a vision has been presented, we believe it would be appropriate, as also agreed, to continue our negotiations, Zelenskyy said. Russia wants more talks before ceasefire. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said the outcome was positive if only for the prospect of prisoners coming home. 1,000 of our people we managed to agree on their return. These are 1,000 happy families. Even for this reason alone, it all made sense, Sybiha wrote on Facebook. Securing a ceasefire was not possible as Russia had sent low-level negotiators, he said. Zelenskyy said Kiev's top priority was a full, unconditional, and honest ceasefire. To stop the killing and create a solid basis for diplomacy. The sides mostly repeated known positions. The Ukrainians wanted an immediate ceasefire and talks to ensue, while the Russians demanded more peace talks before agreeing on a ceasefire. If you want serious negotiations, you need to have guns silent, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesman Hiorai Itikiai told reporters. Expectations for a major breakthrough, already low, were dented further on Thursday when Trump, winding up a Middle East tour, said there would be no movement without a meeting between himself and Putin. Russia says it wants to end the war by diplomatic means and is ready to discuss a ceasefire. But it has raised a list of questions and concerns, saying Ukraine could use a pause to rest its forces, mobilize troops, and acquire more Western weapons. Ukraine and its allies accuse Putin of stalling, and say he is not serious about wanting peace. Calm atmosphere. The negotiating teams sat opposite one another on either side of a U-shaped table, with the Russians dressed in suits while half of the Ukrainians wore military fatigues. A Turkish official said afterwards the atmosphere had been calm during the talks. No concrete timetable or location had been agreed for the next round of talks, the official said, with both sides needing to debrief their leaders first. The Ukrainian source said the Ukrainians spoke in their own language, through an interpreter, although Russian is widely spoken and understood in Ukraine. A Ukrainian and a European source said Russia had rejected a Ukrainian request for US representatives to be in the room. Two sources familiar with the talks said Zelenskyy had said Russia was ready to keep fighting for as long as necessary, drawing a historical parallel with the wars of Tsar Peter the Great against Sweden that lasted 21 years in the early 1700s. We do not want war, but we are ready to fight for a year, 2, 3 as long as you want, one of the sources quoted him as saying. Grinding advance. Russia said on Friday it had captured another village in its slow, grinding advance in eastern Ukraine. Minutes before the start of the Istanbul meeting, Ukrainian media reported an air alert and explosions in the city of Dnipro. Russia says it sees the talks as a continuation of the negotiations that took place in the early weeks of the war in 2022, also in Istanbul. But the terms under discussion then, when Ukraine was still reeling from Russia's invasion, would be deeply disadvantageous to Kiev if they were repeated now. They included a demand by Moscow for large cuts to the size of Ukraine's military. Zelenskyy's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, said Russian attempts to align the new talks with the unsuccessful earlier negotiations would fail. With Russian forces in control of about a fifth of Ukraine, Putin has held fast to demands for Kiev to cede territory, abandon NATO membership ambitions and become a neutral country. Ukraine rejects these terms as tantamount to capitulation, and is seeking guarantees of its future security from world powers, especially the United States. Reporting by Ken Cesar, Humera Pamuk, Tom Baumforth, Vladimir Soldatkin, and Jonathan Spicer in Istanbul, Olena Harmash and Yulia Dissa in Kiev, East Toksabi, and Tuvan Gumrukku in Ankara, John Irish in Paris, Andrew Gray, and Fatos Baitaisi in Tirana and Reuters reporters in Moscow, writing by Mark Trevelyan, editing by Peter Groff, Alex Richardson, Francis Carey, Ron Popsky, and Cynthia Osterman. Vladimir Putin has sacked the chief of the Russian military's land forces, General Oleg Salyukov, according to a decree published by the Kremlin, in the latest removal of a high-profile figure from Russia's military during its war on Ukraine. Salyukov, 70, will become a deputy to the also sacked Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who was removed in 2024 and made Secretary of the Security Council. The development came as the Russian president snubbed peace talks that he suggested in Turkey with Ukraine. Putin instead sent a lower-level delegation to Istanbul, and Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who had promised to attend if Putin did, reciprocated with the Ukrainian negotiating contingent. Putin had insisted on the Istanbul meeting instead of agreeing to the long-standing offer by Ukraine and its allies of a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, said Putin and Russia would face new sanctions as a consequence. The fact that President Zelenskyy traveled to Istanbul despite this is an enormous gesture, Merz posted. Putin didn't show up, and that put him in the wrong. A new sanctions package is ready. We will adopt it in Brussels on Tuesday. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer accused Putin of stymieing progress on peace. There was only one country that started this conflict, that was Russia. That was Putin, he said, speaking in Albania. There's only one country now standing in the way of peace, that is Russia. That is Putin. There's only one country now standing in the way of peace, that is Russia. That is Putin. France's foreign minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, echoed that sentiment. In front of Ukrainians, there is an empty chair, one that should have been occupied by Vladimir Putin, he said. Putin is dragging his feet and in all evidence does not want to enter into these peace discussions. Due to Putin's no-show, it appeared that any talks taking place would only begin in earnest on Friday, under Turkey's supervision. Zelenskyy on Thursday arrived in Turkey's capital, Ankara, for separate meetings, having said he would meet Putin in Istanbul if the Russian president arrived. Late on Thursday, Turkey's foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, met the Russian delegation. The meeting has ended. Tomorrow there will be more talks in different formats, said a Turkish foreign ministry source, indicating that trilateral talks between Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey are on the agenda. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said on Thursday, "I want to be frank. I don't think we have high expectations of what will happen tomorrow." The top U.S. diplomat described the current state of the talks to end the war as a logjam that only Donald Trump could break. Trump, the U.S. president, offered a tangled version of events. Obviously he wasn't going to go, Trump said of Putin. He was going to go, but he thought I was going to go. He wasn't going if I wasn't there. He told reporters on Air Force One, I don't believe anything's going to happen, whether you like it or not, until he and I get together. Ukraine lost an F-16 fighter plane, though the pilot had time to eject safely, the Air Force announced on Friday morning. According to preliminary data, an unusual situation arose on board. The pilot moved the aircraft away from the settlement and successfully ejected. Estonia accused Russia on Thursday of posing a serious threat to NATO after a Russian fighter jet violated its airspace. Estonia said it detected the incursion on Tuesday while it was inspecting a tanker from the shadow fleet of ships that Russia is using to skirt sanctions. The Estonian Foreign Minister, Margus Tsahkna, told a NATO meeting in Turkey that Estonia was inspecting the unflagged and uninsured Argent Jaguar tanker, which is sanctioned by the United Kingdom, when the Russian plane violated Estonia's airspace. NATO fighter jets scrambled to inspect and check the Russian fighter. Russian President Vladimir Putin, during a joint press conference in Moscow, shared a funny story from Malaysian Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim's private tour of the Kremlin. Inside St. Andrew's Hall, Putin showed Anwar 3 thrones, one each for the Tsar and Tsarina. The third one was unlabeled. When asked who the third was for, Anwar quickly joked, "For the second wife," making everyone laugh. Putin replied that it was a true Muslim answer. "That is the answer of a true Muslim, a representative of Islamic culture," the Russian president quipped. "I only have one wife, Mr. President. But I felt it was a trick, a test. I said the right throne was for the wife, the left for the second wife. But later I realized it was actually for the mother," he said. Anwar Ibrahim's Islamic push. In November 2024, the Malaysian PM denied claims that he was pushing Islamic concepts too much in his government. Such accusations came after he had announced plans to expand the role of Joachim, the Islamic Development Department. Anwar said the criticism, mainly from a few non-Muslims, showed a lack of understanding of Islam's real values. "I want Joachim not only to talk about religion and Islamic law. Joachim, now under my administration as Prime Minister and the unity government, will expand its duties, talk about economic issues, look at digital programs, and look at the education curriculum," he said. "The responsibility is broader, so that the values of Islam can be applied, and this is objected to by those who do not understand," he added. During the visit, PM Anwar Ibrahim spoke about the 2014 MH17 plane crash. This came soon after a United Nations Aviation Council blamed Russia for the crash, which killed all 298 people on board. Russia has rejected the UN findings, calling them unfair. Anwar posted on Facebook that Malaysia would keep demanding justice and accountability for the victims and their families. The Malaysian PM also shared that, during their meeting, Putin offered condolences to those who lost loved ones, including 196 Dutch, 43 Malaysians and 38 Australians who were on the flight. The Kremlin unveiled its delegation for Ukraine-Russia peace talks in a decree signed by Russian President Vladimir Putin on May 14. Russia has not shared who it would send to negotiations in Turkey up until now. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said on May 14 that Kiev will determine its next steps in Ukraine-Russia peace talks when Moscow unveils its delegation. Putin was not on the list of delegates, nor were any other top-ranking Russian officials. Moscow announced that their delegation would be headed by presidential advisor and propaganda architect, Vladimir Medinsky. The Russian delegation will also consist of Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin, Military Intelligence Director Igor Kostyukov, and Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin. The delegation is notably void of the Kremlin's top politicians, including Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, was also absent from the list. Putin has refused calls for a ceasefire and instead insists peace negotiations begin before a ceasefire is implemented. In response, Zelenskyy has said he will travel to Turkey for the peace talks, and has invited Putin to meet him there. So far, Russia has given no signal that Putin will be present at the peace negotiations on May 15. Russia has said the May 15 talks would be a resumption of 2022 peace negotiations held in Turkey at the onset of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine in February 2022. According to the leaked 2022 peace draft proposal, both sides agreed to exclude Crimea from the treaty, leaving it under Russian occupation without Ukraine recognizing Russian sovereignty over it. The status of other Russian-occupied territories was to be decided in later talks between Presidents Zelenskyy and Putin. The treaty would reportedly see Ukraine abandon aspirations to join NATO or any other military alliance, but allow for EU entry. Russia also demanded the lifting of all sanctions, repealing Kiev's laws related to language and national identity, and limiting Ukraine's armed forces. The negotiations were unsuccessful and did not lead to the signing of any agreements. After that, there were no direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. The meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin, if it occurs, could signal a breakthrough in stalled diplomatic efforts to end Russia's full-scale invasion. The last and only face-to-face meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin occurred in December 2019 in Paris under the Normandy format. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, there have been no direct meetings between the two. Russian authorities have listed maximalist demands in previous ceasefire negotiations brokered by the US. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has said he will ask Putin to go to Turkey for peace talks with Zelenskyy.